On the night of July 17, 1918, a dynasty that had ruled for over 300 years was wiped out, not on some grand battlefield, but in a bloody, chaotic basement. Today, we're going to dig into the execution of Russia's last imperial family, the Romanovs, to figure out not just how it happened, but more importantly, why.
So picture this. The place is Yekaterinburg, in an industrial city deep in the Ural Mountains. The year is 1918, and the scene? Well, it's a small, cramped, windowless basement room in a building with the grim new name, the House of Special Purpose. It's right here that Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, their 5 children, and 4 of their loyal staff are about to meet their end. Those are the chilling words read out by the head of the firing squad, Yakov Yuravsky. There was no trial, no appeal, no last words. Just a cold, brutally efficient declaration. Before the Tsar could even really register what was said, the room just erupted in gunfire.
And that brings us to the core question of all this, doesn't it? Why this level of brutality? Why murder not just the deposed Tsar, but his wife and all of their children too? To answer that, we have to rewind the clock.
Okay, so let's go back and look at the world the Romanovs actually ruled, the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century. It was this vast, sprawling empire, but it was also a land of massive, massive contradictions. I mean, you just have this enormous disconnect. On one hand, you have Tsar Nicholas, who truly saw himself as a little father, literally appointed by God to look after his people. But for the vast majority of his 125 million subjects, the reality was a life of just grinding poverty, being treated like serfs in horrific factory conditions. The so-called father was completely and utterly detached from the suffering of his children.
A disconnect like that can't last forever, and it didn't. In 1905, you have Bloody Sunday, where peaceful protesters were just gunned down in the streets. That shattered the Tsar's fatherly image for good. Then World War I was the final straw. It cost millions of Russian lives and just wrecked the economy. By March of 1917, the people had simply had enough. The army joined the protests, and Nicholas was forced to abdicate. And just like that, 3 centuries of Romanov rule were over.
So, the Tsar is gone. But here's the thing about power vacuums. Something always rushes in to fill them. And in this case, what rushed in was a new, radical, and ruthless ideology, led by one man, Vladimir Lenin.
Lenin's vision was absolutely uncompromising. He believed that to build a new socialist world, the old one had to be completely obliterated. This idea was called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Basically, a revolutionary government that would use violence to crush anyone they considered an enemy. And this is so key to understanding the murder of the children. It wasn't just about politics. It was about wiping the slate clean. In this view, the entire family, simply by existing as symbols of the old world, were class enemies who had to be eradicated.
So how did Lenin get people on board with such a radical vision? With simple, incredibly powerful slogans that spoke directly to what people were desperate for: peace, land, and bread. It promised an end to the war, land for the peasants, and food for the starving. And you know what? It worked. In October 1917, his Bolshevik party seized power.
Now, with the Bolsheviks in charge, the fate of the imperial family takes a very dark, very rapid turn. This is the start of their journey from being deposed monarchs to condemned prisoners. At first, they were under a fairly comfortable house arrest at one of their palaces. But as the political situation got more and more extreme, they were moved further and further away, first to the remote city of Tobolsk in Siberia, and then finally to Yekaterinburg. Each move stripped away more of their dignity and tightened their confinement, until the Ipatiev house became their final prison.
And here's why they were becoming so dangerous to the new government. A full-blown civil war was raging between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Army. As long as Nicholas and his young son Alexei were alive, they were living, breathing symbols. They were a potential king and a future heir that could unite all the forces fighting against the Bolsheviks. They went from being political prisoners to a strategic liability that had to be eliminated.
This all brings us to that critical moment in July 1918. The White Army is getting closer and closer to Yekaterinburg. A decision has to be made, and it will be the point of no return.
So, did Lenin himself give the order to kill them? This is where it gets a little complicated. There is no smoking gun, no signed piece of paper from Lenin that says, "Execute the Romanovs." But this circumstantial evidence is just overwhelming.
We know Moscow sent a coded telegram giving the local authorities the go-ahead. We know Lenin kept an iron grip on all major decisions, and frankly, the execution fit perfectly with his state-sanctioned policy of Red Terror. Most historians agree, an order of this magnitude would not have happened without his approval.
And so, we're back in that basement. Yurovsky reads the sentence. The shooting starts, and it's just pure chaos. In this incredibly tragic and bizarre detail, the daughters had sewn family jewels into their corsets for safekeeping. Those jewels actually deflected some of the first bullets, prolonging their agony until they were finished off with bayonets. It was a horrific, brutal end.
But the execution itself, that was really only the beginning of the story. The act was so brutal that for decades, the new Soviet government denied the full truth, and that created a mystery that would take most of the 20th century to finally solve.
For over 70 years, the truth about where the family was buried remained a state secret. Their bodies were hastily dumped in an unmarked mine shaft in a forest, doused in acid, and completely hidden from the world.
But eventually, the truth came out. The grave was secretly found way back in 1979 by some local amateur historians. It wasn't until after the fall of the Soviet Union that the remains were finally exhumed. And then, through DNA testing, with samples from relatives like Britain's Prince Philip, the identities were confirmed. The family was finally given a proper state burial in 1998, and the last two children were found in a second grave nearby in 2007, finally reuniting them all.
And that's really what this whole story leaves us with. Look, the Romanovs were the heads of a flawed and often oppressive system, no doubt. But they were also a family. Parents and children, executed without trial in a basement. Their story is a chilling reminder of what can happen when any political cause, no matter how noble its goals might seem, decides that human life is disposable. It forces us to ask, at what point does ideology outweigh humanity?